Thank you, Madam Chair. For the record, I'm State Representative Bruce Dammeier. I have the privilege of representing the good people of the 25th Legislative District. Madam Chair, I appreciate the opportunity to testify before this bill today. I appreciate your sponsorship, that of the Vice Chair and the ranking member on this and the other assistant ranking member on this. I think this is an important piece of legislation. And I think it's important that I set a little bit of the context. We have some newer members on this committee, including our two newest members. So I think there is an important role in giving them a little insight into how we got here. First of all, we're all very well familiar with our constitutional responsibility. Our forefathers clearly saw that education was critical to a successful democracy and economic prosperity. They put that paramount duty language in our Constitution with very strong effect. It is the strongest language of any of the state constitutions. The other bit of background that is important to know is that in 2009, this body passed House Bill 2261, which not only had the sponsorship of myself and 4 other members of this committee, but laid out a plan. It acknowledged the challenges of where we are and laid out a plan going forward that would rectify that would get us to get our children to where they needed to be and get our state to funding what it deserves and needs to fund. Then as we came into this session, we had the landmark McCleary hearing. And many of you know that that was not the first landmark hearing on education issues, that back in 1977 we had Dorn 1 that essentially addressed the same issue, that we were not living up to our paramount duty to fund our schools. There's a few things that I think are fundamentally different in this McCleary hearing. First of all, we know that the Dorn decision on itself was not sufficient to change the legislature's behavior. We're back there again with a similar type of ruling. The second thing that we noted is that the ruling was particularly sharp in its criticism and particularly sharp in some of its language that it used. I would like to quote just briefly from page 47 in the ruling, where it says, "The state must amply provide for the education of all Washington children as the state's first and highest priority before any other state programs or operations." I think that's very significant. The third thing is that it requires continued court oversight. That's very significant for us in our separation of powers. And the fourth and final thing would be that we know today the education of our children is even more critical for their future success than it was back in 1977. So with that, the bill before you is exceedingly simple. It merely says we need to pull out the K-12 section of the budget, the funding of our schools, and pass it separately and before the rest of the omnibus budget, for the omnibus operating budget. That is my intent behind this bill is that it would shine the bright light of accountability on our paramount duty, on our responsibility, on our promises in House Bill 2261, that it would force us to vote on that. It's as simple as that. It's a very simple concept and a very simple bill, that it would directly give us an opportunity to directly say, are we living up to our paramount duty and are we achieving those promises? I would like to address a couple of potential complaints or a couple of opposition criticisms that could come up to this bill. The first is that it's a change in process. It doesn't provide any additional dollars. That is absolutely accurate. It does not guarantee we provide additional dollars, but it does guarantee that we hold ourselves accountable with a vote, specifically on education issues, specifically on our paramount duty, specifically on our responsibility to fund our schools. The second thing is people say, well, isn't this a partisan political gimmick? And I would argue absolutely not. The members of this committee know that I've worked hard in my time down here to make the funding of our schools and our education issues a bipartisan issue. And I'm proud of the bipartisan sponsorship of this bill, and I'm proud of the bipartisan work on House Bill 2261. So this has nothing to do with that whatsoever. In fact, Madam Chair, I think this will work to depoliticize part of our budget, to depoliticize education. And if you'll pardon me, one of the things that I also think would be very beneficial, there's an old adage of how do you eat an elephant? And the answer is one bite at a time. I believe if we were to pull the schools portion out of the omnibus budget where it competes with all the other programs, that might help our process move the budget along in a more efficient, more effective, and more transparent manner. The final one is people say, well, what about the other programs that affect kids? A hungry child cannot learn. I couldn't agree more. This bill does not say that our schools are our only priority. It says, as the court requires, that they are our first priority. We certainly have many other priorities. And I would agree that a hungry student can't learn. But we all know on this committee, I'm sure, that a quality education is the surest way to lift someone out of poverty, more effective than any other state program we have. And finally, in conclusion, Madam Chair, I would argue that the status quo is continuing to fail. Fund education first. This bill is not a silver bullet, but it does force us to face up to our responsibility, to our paramount duty. Madam Chair, I believe all of our students deserve it. I believe our Constitution demands it. And I believe our economic prosperity is dependent upon it. Thank you. I'd be open to any questions.
And I'm going to just make a quick question. Our budget this year, these last 2 years, is over $13 billion for public education. And that doesn't include all children, because it doesn't include children birth to 5. And we will struggle with what's basic, and we will struggle with what's ample. If we were going to make a decision about ample for every student, do you believe that this bill would get down to that classroom level, service level, education level for every child in this state? I guess in your heart of hearts, do you believe by doing it at this level first, without really identifying the amount of money that needs to go out to every single child in this state to make ample education, do you believe this bill is going to get us to that point?
Madam Chair, I appreciate the question very much. And as you and I both know, this debate is the important thing. And that's the key thing that I think this does. Those are very important issues that you bring up. You know, early childhood and higher ed on both ends of K-12 of our basic education requirement are really important issues. And I think those are important debates that we must have. And I believe that if we were to pass, and if the legislature were to enact this bill, that they will facilitate that debate, that they will get us to confront the challenges that we faced in a direct way. I can remember when, back when 2261 was passed, I can remember having a conversation with Representative Orwell in particular, and we were talking about that passing that bill alone was probably the easiest vote we would take, that downstream there would be much more difficult votes as we implement. This bill is intended to facilitate and force those difficult debates and those difficult votes.
We have a question from Representative Anderson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Actually, my question is for staff, and I feel guilty because Kristen sounds like she's lost her voice. My question is since the Duran decision, has the definition of paramount duty through Duran,
Great Dorn.
that would be Duran would be Duran too. Has the definition as put forward by the courts in the various decisions and opinions that have come down, has the definition of paramount duty at any time changed?
The recent ruling from the state Supreme Court in McCleary confirmed the court's explanation of the paramount duty. In the, to avoid mispronunciation, I refer to it as the school funding or Seattle School District case. In that ruling from 1978, so they've affirmed the interpretation of what paramount means in terms of first or foremost.
Okay, just a short follow-up. Yeah, okay. So it's been consistent since 1978 when it was first put forward?
Yeah, the interpretation of the constitutional term, correct.
Yes. Okay, and in the plain language of the term paramount duty, as superior to all other things, the assumption we make in that it is superior to all of, therefore it is separate and discrete. Is that a reasonable?
Well, that would, I guess, that's a question that's a little bit difficult for me to comment on, Representative Anderson. Representative Dammeier cited the quote from the court ruling about paramount, meaning that the K-12 basic plan needs to be appropriated in terms of a highest priority. I can't say that that means it needs to be first in time, but the court did use the term as a first priority.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, we have, I'm going to allow 2 more questions. They're going to be very, very brief because we have 13 people who want to testify on this bill. Representative Sequist.
Thank you, Madam Chair. First, let me ask you if there is another way to get to this same point. I agree with the priorities, but what I worry about is that if we agreed exactly what the definition of basic education was and funded it fully on day one, we would have fenced ourselves out of a series of other trade-off decisions. Throughout the rest of the budget, we would day after day come up with, well, should I put another $1 million into early learning, or should it go here? Or should I put that money into some agency's program, or would I get more of an output over here? So suppose rather than this approach, we actually created a separate education budget and worked it up to the end of the whole budget building process.
So thank you, Representative Sequist. I appreciate the question. I think it is important that we recognize that the court did 2 things that are important. First is they clearly acknowledged that 2261 lays out a path, that we don't need to be there today, that indeed we can't get there today, but we need to make progress toward that promise, toward that thing that we believe is the right thing for the students and right thing for the state of Washington by 2018. The second thing the court did is also acknowledge that the definition of basic education is not static and cast in concrete. That the definition today is different in some degrees than the definition of 1977. That was what 2261 was all about. And indeed, it will evolve as we go forward, as we address technology and things like that.
Okay, even quicker, Representative Rickdahl.
Thank you. Representative Dammeier, you referenced 2 monstrous reform bills that you were a part of in prior years. And as you know, no budget goes forward without the implication of other policy bills that we make necessary to implement. Would your concept here require that we also act on the ambitions of policy bills that are potentially linked to the budgets, as those 2 measures were, or say charter schools or some funding ambition we have in a policy bill? Would that also have to go first and consistent with the education budget?
So I'm primarily thinking of the funding to the degree that we are assuming there are important efficiencies, just like in our current budget. I think if there are bills that would significantly affect the outcome of that budget, then I think they would need to be assumed and planned for in part of that budget. That's how I would respond to that. Thank you.
Representative Dahlquist.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And maybe this is a question better asked of staff, but just quickly, how many other states actually take the education budget out and figure it separately prior to any other part of the budget?
Representative Dahlquist, I haven't researched that, but I can look into it for you.
And I would just comment that many other states do not fully fund, are not required to fully fund education from the state level. Many states really have communities relying on local, ongoing tax revenue sources to pay for their schools. So it's hard to compare. Okay.
And just really quick, there is no question, the federal government has separate appropriations. Other states do separate appropriations. They do not do one omnibus budget. And we do have the strongest constitutional language in the nation.
Thank you.
Thank you.